having treated 230. That's just one aid organization. That does not include those who received treatment from other organizations. It does not include those who received no treatment at all. And it does not include the women and girls who the Tatmadaw killed or who succumbed to injuries while making their way to Bangladesh. The Physicians for Human Rights survey that Mr. Reichler mentioned noted that healthcare providers reported higher numbers of pregnant women during months that corresponded to the patients having conceived in and around August 2017. In the words of one physician, 9 months after August 2017, there was a huge increase in the birth rate. The implications are obvious. I turn now to another part of the modus operandi, the intentional killing of children. I addressed its legal significance in the first round. Myanmar left it unrebutted. Instead, Myanmar's response was limited to Ms. Lowry's statement that the reference to children in the counter memorial reflected the fact that, as she put it, Rohingya youths included those who in most societies would be counted as children, but are nonetheless found in the rank and file of those confronting the military, thereby putting themselves in the way of harm, and, she said, were indistinguishable from older persons. Mr. President, in the first round, I observed that Médecins Sans Frontières estimates between 734 and 2,109 children under the age of 5 died during the clearance operations or were killed during the flight to Bangladesh. Myanmar made no attempt to challenge those statistics. Not a single one of those deaths can be said to reflect an adolescent who chose to put him or herself in harm's way. Nor can the testimony of the witnesses you heard last week. MN described the death of his 8-year-old nephew, NJ the murder of her 2-year-old son, MS the slaughter of 5 of his children. They were 14, 11, 9, 7, and 3. These murders of children, of innocents, not those lining up to fight government forces, were conducted by separate units of the Tatmadaw, specifically the 33rd Lid in Chapien, the 99th Lid in Mingi, and the 564th Light Infantry Battalion in Mongnu. The reality, Mr. President, is that the record is full of reliable evidence that the killing of young children, including toddlers, infants, even the unborn, formed part of the Tatmadaw's modus operandi in both waves of clearance operations. In that connection, I underscore that the evidence from 2016 is consistent with that from 2017. In other words, they both followed the same modus operandi. That's not surprising. They were closely connected episodes in a broader genocidal program in which the killing of children was central. The PILPG survey included dozens of respondents who recounted brutal attacks against children, including the abduction and disappearances of children, the execution of dozens of children in a single attack, and children being stabbed, slaughtered, dismembered, and beheaded. Respondents recounted babies being smashed against floors and walls, thrown out of windows, thrown into fires, thrown into rivers, thrown up in the air and caught on a sword, or thrown into wells. Many witness statements include accounts of the intentional killing of young children, and many such accounts were obtained by the FFM. To cite but a very few examples, a survivor from Kiep Yo Pin described to the mission seeing the Tatmadaw kill 2 young children who were searching for their mother. The older of the 2, a 6-year-old boy, had his throat cut. The younger, just 4 years old, was stamped to death before the body was thrown into a nearby burning house. Similarly, a 14-year-old boy told the mission how, in Kiok Pandu, he witnessed the Tatmadaw push 10 Rohingya, mainly children, into a house and set it on fire. He believes everyone was killed. The boy recounted one of the children was stabbed when the group tried to leave the house. As you heard last week, Professor Newton has no doubt that each of these features of the clearance operations, the targeting of civilians, including those fleeing, the sexual violence, and the killing of children, was part of the Tatmadaw's modus operandi. None is remotely reconcilable with counterterrorism. Mr. President, this brings me to the next part of the modus operandi, the systematic destruction, often through building, of Rohingya villages. The numbers are effectively undisputed. As I noted during the first round, UNICEF determined that as of the 18th of October 2018, at least 178 Rohingya villages had been totally destroyed by fire, with an additional 214 partially destroyed. Did Myanmar present expert testimony showing that UNICEF was wrong? No, although Mr. Blom-Cooper did opine that he might have identified a few structures that he thinks may have survived. Myanmar also tries to argue that the destruction of these villages somehow doesn't count. Why? Because some destruction may have occurred after the 5th of September 2017, when Myanmar claims to have ceased carrying out anti-terrorism operations. But the truth is, Myanmar did not stop then. Here's what the FFM had to say about the matter. While the government has claimed that clearance operations had ended on the 5th of September, in fact, military engagement continued well into October. This included its efforts to systematically and comprehensively destroy huge swaths of Rohingya villages, as the IIMM documented in its September 2025 report. I reviewed that report with you in detail in the first round. Myanmar had next to nothing to say in response. The most it could muster was to seek to cast doubt as to who is responsible for the program of burning. But the answer is clear and provided in the IIMM report itself, as Mr. Reichler showed you this morning. So too is it found in the December 2017 International Crisis Group report that Mr. Reichler also discussed. Let's be perfectly clear about what the wholesale burning of hundreds of Rohingya villages meant for the Rohingya who had lived in those villages. It was described by the FFM in the following terms. The clearance operations forced hundreds of thousands of Rohingya to flee and walk for days, even weeks, through forests and over mountains to reach Bangladesh. On this journey, many more died or were killed or injured. There was minimum shelter, with people having to sleep in the open, with little food or water. This directly impacted Rohingya mortality. The mission determined the appalling conditions of the journey contributed to the high number of casualties. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya fled with little or no notice and few, if any, possessions. Many had sustained injuries and needed urgent medical care. Mr. President, those appalling conditions are vividly described in the witness statement of Alex Crawford and Neville Lazarus, television journalists with Sky News, who managed to visit Northern Rakhine State in November 2017. You can find it at Annex 374 of the memorial. The video they made of their visit, cited in their statement, can be watched through the link included in the footnote in the compte rendu. The Rohingya facing such conditions had no illusions that they had any prospect of receiving assistance from the same Tatmadaw who had committed horrific atrocities against them. The FFM found that continuing clearance operations and the presence of large numbers of Tatmadaw soldiers and other security forces made it dangerous to travel on main roads or seek shelter or provisions in other villages. Instead, villagers walked for days or weeks in forest and mountain areas, sleeping in makeshift shelters or in the open during heavy monsoon rains and without sufficient food or water. These dire conditions, the mission found, disproportionately affected the most vulnerable, including children and the elderly. Many persons died and were buried in makeshift graves. Here is how one woman described the situation, an account the mission concluded was typical of many. It took 9 days to reach Bangladesh. On the way, I saw 4 or 5 decapitated heads by the side of the road. One of our group died on the journey, a small boy. One woman gave birth. I had a packet of biscuits with me, but nothing else. It was raining heavily. Everything was burning around us. Mr. President, the Tatmadaw's modus operandi included the specific targeting of Rohingya attempting to traverse this hellscape. The scale is indicated by data collected by Médecins Sans Frontières, indicating that fully 13.4% of violent deaths occurred during the period between displacement from their village and arrival in Bangladesh. To be clear, these were not killings that occurred in the context of village-specific clearance operations. Instead, the FFM determined that Tatmadaw soldiers shot at groups of Rohingya who were en route. This included attacks in villages that had already been burned, where fleeing Rohingya were seeking refuge on their journey, as well as attacks in forested areas or when Rohingya were forced into the open, for example, when crossing rivers. The mission's report is replete with evidence that confirms the ever-present danger that Rohingya faced from the Tatmadaw. A woman from Buthodong Township described to the mission how, after walking for 2 days, she and her group were near a river crossing when soldiers opened fire at people as they were crossing. She saw 2 people shot. Another survivor recounted how he and his family were awaiting a boat to carry them across the river when a group of soldiers and police opened fire at a boat carrying people across, killing 4 of the passengers. And here is what still another survivor told the mission. My grandson, who was 3 years old, died when my daughter-in-law jumped into a river while crossing the canal. The military started shooting at people who were about to cross the river. She was afraid and jumped into the river with her son. The child drowned and we found his body later on. Mr. President, I take this opportunity to present the Gambia's observations in regard to Judge Charles Worth's question that asked Myanmar for its views regarding who is responsible for the 178 Rohingya villages that had been totally destroyed by fire by the 18th of October 2017, and the additional villages that had been partially destroyed by that date, including whether Myanmar considers those villages to have been destroyed by ARSA, and if so, the evidence supporting that contention. In considering Myanmar's forthcoming answer, the Gambia respectfully suggests that the court take into account the witness statement of Jonathan Head, the BBC's Southeast Asia correspondent. As recounted in his witness statement, he was present in Northern Rakhine State in September 2017. Mr. Head provides a detailed account of Myanmar's efforts to falsely portray the Rohingya as having burned their own homes. This was done through the staging of photographs and the enlistment of members of the Hindu community to pose as Rohingya in an attempt to con the journalists into reporting that the Rohingya themselves were responsible. Mr. Head and his fellow journalists saw through the sham. The court can find his statement at Annex 375 of the memorial. The relevant paragraphs are 15 to 19. Mr. President, this concludes my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention. I ask that you invite Mr. Suleiman to the podium.
I thank Mr. Lowenstein for his statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Al-Salan Suleiman. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the court, good afternoon again. I will respond to Myanmar's attempt to persuade you that in attacking Rohingya civilians indiscriminately, engaging in mass murder, killing children and infants, raping and gang raping women and girls, burning homes and villages, and shooting and killing fleeing refugees, the Tatmadaw were engaging in authentic counterterrorism operations. There is no counterterrorism justification for the sickening genocidal acts committed during Myanmar's clearance operations. This conclusion is confirmed by the convincing testimony of the victim witnesses from the 3 main villages who fully corroborate the findings of the UN FFM. And that conclusion is also supported by the authoritative and conclusive expert testimony provided by Professor Michael Newton. I will respond to Myanmar's arguments and the questions from judges in relation to ARSA's capabilities and why Myanmar's clearance operations were not authentic counterterrorism exercises. I will then comment upon Myanmar's unreliable evidence. Before I do so, I raise 2 points. First, as my colleagues have mentioned, Mr. Staker has conceded that genocide can be committed during counterterrorism operations. That means that counterterrorism is mere context and not a viable alternative intent to genocide. Second, throughout the entirety of Myanmar's first round, not a single mention was made of the Arakan Army or any other ethnic armed organization. Not a single mention. That is quite remarkable and revealing, especially after the comparison I drew in the first round between the acts committed against the Rohingya community in purported reaction to ARSA and the treatment of the Rakhine and other ethnic communities in the context of the Tatmada's ongoing conflict against the Arakan Army and other ethnic armed organizations. Recall that the rules of engagement for ARSA and the Arakan Army are the exact same. Myanmar has provided no explanation for the difference in treatment of the Rohingya and Rakhine communities. The only reasonable explanation for the differential treatment is Myanmar's genocidal intent for the Rohingya. Now, turning to ARSA and its capabilities. Judge Brandt, also on behalf of Judge Charlesworth and Judge Cleveland, asked for the parties' characterizations of ARSA's representativeness within the civilian population, its strength, estimated size, organization, and hierarchical structure, and military and weapons capabilities. On this matter, the Gambia relies primarily on the reporting of the UNFFM and the IIMM, both of which provide independent and objective information on the capabilities of ARSA that included official information released publicly by Myanmar. Paragraphs 1009 to 1067 of the 2018 detailed FFM report are particularly helpful on this question. Regarding ARSA's representativeness and estimated size, the FFM reported that, quote, total numbers of members and supporters are difficult to ascertain. The actual membership seems to have been small, but the support base was certainly in the hundreds. This includes the last-minute mobilization of many Rohingya, with many of those who participated in the 25 August 2017 attacks mobilized only shortly before that day or on the day itself. However, overall membership and support for ARSA represented a minority of the total population, end quote. According to the FFM, quote, supporters claim to be motivated by the need to fight long-standing discrimination against the Rohingya and the denial of human rights. Some had personally suffered oppression and abuse by the Tatmada or other security forces, end quote. In any event, Myanmar's rules of engagement are still fully applicable, regardless of ARSA's size, as confirmed by the testimony of Professor Newton. Regarding ARSA's strength and military and weapons capabilities, the UN FFM reported that, quote, ARSA is commonly regarded as a poorly armed and poorly trained group, with a small number of partly trained members, but principally relying on untrained villagers to conduct attacks with sticks and knives. In comparison with the long-standing and well-armed non-state armed groups active in northern Myanmar, ARSA's level of organization and military capacity appears more limited, end quote. In terms of training, the FFM reported that, quote, a core group of ARSA members received some military training, including in weaponry. Some who had received weapons training then replicated it for others, although often without weapons, by using hand gestures and wooden models, end quote. Those who were, quote, mobilized shortly prior to the 2017 attacks had no training and little information about the group, end quote. As to weaponry, the FFM reports, quote, for the 2017 attacks, most ARSA members were without firearms, but equipped with homemade weapons such as sticks, knives, swords, and slingshots, and some homemade explosives. One ARSA member told the FFM that, quote, all they did was give us a stick and said that we should pretend that it is a weapon. We never got any training or weapons, end quote. The IIMM similarly found that at the time of the August 2017 attacks, ARSA only had a, quote, modest arsenal of around 40 to 70 firearms, end quote. The, quote, majority of ARSA members used bladed weapons, sticks, and a small number of locally produced artisanal firearms, end quote. Imagine how outgunned and outmanned they were by the thousands of heavily armed Tatmadaw who were awaiting them, having been pre-deployed across northern Rakhine State with automated weapons, mortars, and other heavy equipment. Does Myanmar really expect us to believe that ARSA intended to capture and control all of northern Rakhine State? In fact, they were quickly routed by the Tatmadaw and forced to abandon the field in less than 3 days, according to an IIMM witness statement submitted by Myanmar. Counsel for Myanmar mentioned IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, over 10 times in their first round. This is what the FFM found regarding IED use. Quote, ARSA did have some capacity to produce crude IEDs, but that capacity is questionable, both in terms of production and execution. As one ARSA member elaborated, the IEDs were made locally by members and are not particularly strong. We use them just to scare the military. In the attack in which he participated, the explosive was not directed at the checkpoint as intended, and no military casualties were reported. While the Myanmar government's list of ARSA attacks mentions the use of IEDs by ARSA, none of the casualties sustained by the Myanmar security forces were reported as having been caused by an IED, end quote. The FFM also noted that, quote, the government reported that during the 2017 clearance operations, it confiscated 15 assorted arms, 97 ammunitions, and 67 homemade IEDs. These figures demonstrate ARSA's weaponry capacity at the time, in particular when juxtaposed against the military capacity of the Tatmadaw, end quote. As to the nature of ARSA's attacks, the FFM reported that, quote, ARSA was able to carry out multiple coordinated attacks in a highly controlled and militarized environment, but with little military capability. The attacks employed hit-and-run tactics with predominantly untrained civilians, mostly wielding sticks and knives. The ARSA attacks caused minimal Tatmadaw casualties compared to their own losses, end quote. An ARSA participant in the 2017 attacks told the FFM of those attacks, quote, it was not really like a military attack by us. It was a protest or uprising, claiming our rights, end quote. Regarding ARSA's organization, the FFM reported that, quote, in its early stages, the organization did not have a name or clearly defined goals. It was loosely organized around the principle of seeking justice for the Rohingya Muslim community, end quote. ARSA's forces are organized hierarchically under a commander-in-chief, who is currently under arrest pending prosecution in Bangladesh. Myanmar did not even declare ARSA a terrorist organization until 25 August 2017, which gives an indication of its own assessment of its capabilities up to that point. Both Mr. Blom-Cooper and Ms. Lowry stated that ARSA's objective was to, quote, obtain, quote, complete control over northern Rakhine State, end quote. Their citation to Myanmar's counter-memorial does not support such a claim. Curiously, they also cited to the FFM report. The paragraphs that they cited in that report also do not support their claim. And the very next paragraph in the FFM report directly disputes their position. According to the UNFFM, quote, while high-level Myanmar officials imply that ARSA seeks an independent state, homeland, or caliphate, the mission has not seen such statements from ARSA, end quote. Ms. Lowry stressed ARSA's use of WhatsApp to coordinate activities as a sign of its sophistication. Frankly, that just shows the opposite. ARSA, by the way, also had a Twitter account that it opened in March 2017, which is controlled by a political group made up of 5 people living outside of Myanmar. Both Ms. Lowry and Mr. Blom-Cooper cited a call by ARSA's leader to burn down villages as part of the attacks. And both of them ignored the evidence that the Gambia cited to show that the call was not heeded. Recall that according to Myanmar's own source, Amnesty International, quote, while Amnesty International has confirmed that some Rohingya villagers participated in ARSA attacks, the overwhelming majority of Rohingya did not. Even in the specific villages where attacks occurred, there is no question that most villagers did not take part in ARSA attacks, end quote. Similarly, the International Crisis Group concluded that the ARSA commander's call to burn down Rakhine Buddhist villages, quote, does not appear to have been widely acted upon, as only 3 non-Rohingya villages are known to have been attacked or burned down by Rohingya, end quote. The fact that this call was not heeded shows the lack of support for ARSA among the Rohingya. The fact that 2 counsel for Myanmar ignored this reality shows the extent they are willing to go to concoct a sham defense for their client. Evidence placed into the record by Myanmar after the close of the written pleadings shows that Myanmar closely surveilled ARSA, knew about many of its members, and yet did not take action to dismantle the organization. According to the testimony of IIMM witness P4715, quote, it was well known that the authorities were surveilling ARSA and knew about its members. They found out about ARSA members from informants. Although the authorities received information about ARSA from informants, they never tried to dismantle ARSA. This has always puzzled me. I believe they allowed ARSA to exist because what they really wanted was to attack our villages and empty them. All of these factors combined have led me to believe that Myanmar government allowed ARSA to exist as a justification to keep persecuting us until we were gone, end quote. This is from Myanmar's own evidence. It was Myanmar that put this witness statement into the record, and they have to live with it. It is also noteworthy that Myanmar passed in silence on the undisputed evidence cited in the first round regarding the Tatmadaws' recent collaboration with ARSA to fight the Arakan army. Myanmar's efforts to trump up the threat posed by ARSA is undermined by its own manipulation of and collaboration with them. By all measures, ARSA was not of the same caliber of organization as the Arakan army or other ethnic armed groups in Myanmar. It was a fledgling group, never a match for the Tatmadaw, more of a pawn, and was used as the pretext for Myanmar's genocidal clearance operations. Regarding the second and the last parts of Judge Brandt's question, I note that the FFM reported on Myanmar's public accounting of its own and ARSA's casualties from the 2017 clearance operations. according to the Myanmar government's own reporting in November 2017, quote, 376 Arsa Bengali terrorists killed, 131 ethnic Hindu Bengali people, and 13 members of security force killed. And according to Ms. Lowry, quote, in terms of casualties from the 2016 attacks, the government estimated at the time that 69 Arsa terrorists, 7 Tatmadaw soldiers, and 10 police officers were killed, end quote. I move now to the clearance operations and why the evidence elicited at these hearings confirms the FFM's conclusion that they were not legitimate counterterrorism operations. First, Myanmar has not shown that it made even the slightest effort to distinguish between alleged Arsa terrorists and Rohingya civilians. Ms. Lowry asserted without evidence that Myanmar's references to supporters was to, quote, local villagers who, though not formal Arsa members, joined in Arsa's violence when called to do so. Active adult participants, she asserted. But how does she explain the killings in Tulatoli that witness MS testified about? How does she explain the burning to death of witness NJ's infant in Chutpien, or the gang rape that she endured? How does she explain the execution of over 80 men and boys in Maungnu, as testified by witness MN, the sole survivor? How does she explain the evidence from Amnesty International and the International Crisis Group and the UNFFM that all civilians were targeted without distinction and that very few Rohingya answered the call of Arsa's leader? Perhaps the court will hear more assertions without evidence on Wednesday and Thursday, but there is certainly no evidence that the Tatmadaw made any effort to distinguish between civilians and Arsa as called for by Myanmar's rules of engagement. To the contrary, they purposefully directed their attacks and atrocities against all Rohingya. Regarding Myanmar's position that Arsa supporters comprise men, women, and children, Ms. Lowry asserts that children means youth in the rank and file of those confronting the military. Again, no evidence. Mr. Lowenstein has just fully addressed this point. Second, Myanmar has not shown that it provided protection to Rohingya civilians. Ms. Lowry excuses Myanmar's inciting and arming of ethnic Rakhine and encouraging them to join in the Tatmadaw's attack on the Rohingya population as a, quote, initiative to recruit non-Bengali citizens to a new regional force, end quote. Incredible. Why didn't they recruit Rohingya into such a localized police force? Why were the Rohingya excluded? The answer is obvious. They were always the target for those new militias. That was shown clearly in the video of the Tatmadaw soldier explaining the clearance operations to ethnic Rakhine, calling on them to arm themselves with swords to bravely face the, quote, animal Rohingya. Judge Pillay asked if counsel for Myanmar could provide examples of how, when, and where the Myanmar military protected the people. I will take the liberty of sharing the Gambia's answer. They attacked the Rohingya people, the exact opposite of protecting them. If some Tatmadaw units ignored some Rohingya as they fled the killing and the burning of their villages, they were the exception rather than the rule. You would have to believe the Tatmadaw's self-serving and unreliable daily operation reports and letters to find any claims that the clearance operations were undertaken to protect, quote, ethnic residents or to rescue the, quote, local ethnics / local natives in danger. Of course, the Rohingya were never considered as local ethnics, and there is no reason to believe the Tatmadaw's propaganda in any event. Third, Myanmar has not shown that it adhered to its own rules of engagement. Professor Michael Newton provided authoritative testimony last Thursday as to why he concluded that Myanmar acted with genocidal intent, based on Myanmar not following its own rules of engagement. I won't read all of his testimony back to the court, as I'm sure the court recalls it very clearly. But he said specifically, as part of this quote on your screen, "I learned in the counter memorial that there were rules of engagement. They were not only not followed, they were completely ignored, which is the substantive basis for those statements," end quote. Myanmar also asserts that its clearance operations were conducted only in places where ARSA was active. The insinuation is that the operations were in hot pursuit immediately after ARSA attacks, following the ARSA attackers. But that is not at all how they played out. As explained by the UN FFM, quote, "The security forces' response was immediate, within hours, brutal and grossly disproportionate. Ostensibly to eliminate the terrorist threat posed by ARSA, in the days and weeks that followed, it encompassed hundreds of villages across Mongdao, Buthidaw, and Rathadong townships. The operations targeted and terrorized the entire Rohingya population. The authorities called them clearance operations. They continued for more than 2 months and for a considerable period after the government claimed their completion on 5 September 2017. During the course of the operation, more than 40% of all villages in northern Rakhine State were partially or totally destroyed. The most intense phase was the first 3 weeks, when more than 80% of the destruction was perpetrated," end quote. In the first round, I showed you reply figure 1.2, which shows that Myanmar wholly or partially destroyed at least 188 out of 329 villages where, according to Myanmar, there was no ARSA presence and so no pretense of clearance operations. Myanmar gave no response to that. It is evident that the clearance operations were not limited to areas of actual ARSA activity, but targeted the Rohingya all across northern Rakhine State. As Professor Newton testified, what happened during the clearance operations was not occasional lapses in soldiers following the rules of engagement. It was a wholesale disregard, a completely different intent and plan, a genocidal plan. This was the same conclusion reached by the Public International Law and Policy Group, which concluded, quote, "The investigators also highlighted the likelihood that the military operation could not have been merely a response to the ARSA attacks, debunking the military's narrative of a legitimate counterinsurgency response. The scale, timing, and consistency of the attacks across such a large territory could not have been planned and coordinated in such a short period of time within a few days of the last ARSA attack. The pretense of a clearing operation to protect the state from a Rohingya terrorist insurgency threat rings hollow in the face of so much of this data," end quote. I come now to my last topic, which is Myanmar's evidence. Myanmar did not produce any military officers or experts for oral examination. They initially included a few of them on their witness list, but then withdrew their names before these hearings. Most of Myanmar's factual claims regarding the clearance operations are based primarily or sometimes solely on Myanmar's own military reports or testimony from officers or testimony of individuals taken by the military. These sources of evidence are not reliable or independent. The Myanmar military's overriding interest to protect itself taints the credibility of these sources of evidence. As Professor Newton testified, this is true of other militaries across the world. Military reports are, in his words, absolutely unreliable. There is testimony in the record of Myanmar military reports being fabricated, to which Myanmar has not responded. The IIMM screening note for P5513 details such a fabricated report. In fact, Myanmar has not responded to several fabrications of evidence by the Tatmadaw. There were the fabrications of images seeking to depict Rohingya as aggressors and illegal immigrant invaders in the Tatmadaw's post-clearance operations publication. There is the fabrication of images purporting to depict Rohingya burning their own villages, which was in fact members of the Hindu community, as Mr. Lowenstein just discussed. First-hand testimony confirming this has been provided by BBC journalist Jonathan Head. In his affidavit, he also recollects how, during a government-approved trip to Mongdao after the clearance operations, the military forced an individual from the Hindu community to falsely report that Muslims, rather than the military, had attacked their village. Which brings us now to witness M1 and the Kha Maung Sek incident, the primary example on which Myanmar relies as an example of attacks by ARSA requiring a substantive counterterrorism response. You heard from witness M1 on Friday that around 99 Hindu villagers from 2 adjacent villages were killed there on 25 August 2017. Her statement was not obtained by an independent source, but by Myanmar itself. It is unclear to the Gambia whether witness M1 actually appears in the video that Myanmar played twice last Friday. In response to questions from the President, counsel for Myanmar was unable to specifically identify witness M1 in the video or in the transcript. Today, by letter from Myanmar's agent, we learned that witness M1 did not speak in the video, even though her affidavit seemed to indicate that she did. It is notable that the first accounts of this tragic incident that survivors gave were that the military and/or ethnic Rakhine had attacked the village, a village which, the witness said, was predominantly Rohingya. It was the Myanmar authorities who first attributed the attack to ARSA, announcing so in early September 2017. They then repatriated from Bangladesh the Hindu survivors back to Myanmar, including witness M1, housed them at a Tatmadaw military base, and publicized the accounts that the survivors then gave, that it was ARSA terrorists who were responsible for the attack. Given Myanmar's history of using the Hindu community in Rakhine State to support the military's false narratives, due caution is warranted with regards to witness M1. In these circumstances, it is not surprising that the UN FFM considered itself unable to draw any conclusions about what happened at Kha Maung Sek. In its 2018 detailed report, it said, quote, "The mission interviewed 7 Hindus from Kha Maung Sek and nearby villages who witnessed these events or were victims of abuses in September 2017. The mission has verified that a large number of Hindu victims were killed on 25 August 2017 in Kha Maung Sek. However, the information received was contradictory, including regarding the language spoken by the perpetrators, which, according to the accounts taken, was a key identifying feature since the perpetrators reportedly had their faces covered. The mission's information is insufficient to make any determinations on reasonable grounds regarding the identity of the perpetrators." End quote. In the end, even if ARSA were responsible for this massacre, this would have no bearing on the Gambia's case. The perpetrators of the Kha Maung Sek massacre should be brought to justice, just as Myanmar itself must be held accountable for its genocide of the Rohingya. In conclusion, Myanmar's clearance operations violated all of the fundamental tenets of legitimate counterterrorism operations, including Myanmar's own. They were not authentic counterterrorism operations. The ARSA attacks were, in fact, a pretext for Myanmar's genocidal attacks on the Rohingya. Mr. President, members of the Court, thank you for your kind attention. Mr. President, I request that you call Professor Darjan to the podium to conclude the Gambia's presentations for today.
I thank Mr. Suleiman for his statement. Je donne à présent la parole au professeur.
I now give the floor to Professor Pierre Dargent. You have the floor, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the court, my presentation will deal with the destruction of evidence and impunity. The pleadings of Professor Miron on these matters was lengthy and quite dense, replete with accusations of inconsistencies or errors of law regarding relatively simple matters. Allow me, therefore, to straighten things out one last time. As you know, we are saying two distinct things on this matter, two things that are distinct but complementary. Impunity and destruction of evidence are, on the one hand, and above all, indicators of genocidal intent. Now, why is that? Well, it is because they both result from state action and contribute to the manifestation of a state's policy. Such a policy is at the heart of the notion of dolus specialis, when the responsibility for genocide at stake is that of the state. Myanmar claims that in the Croatia case, the court, and I quote, ruled out impunity as an indicator of genocidal intent and presented on the first day of its pleadings a table with coloured arrows that you might remember, a table with coloured arrows to support this assertion. But this is inaccurate. The court said nothing on the matter and limited its examination to the criteria it believed to be the most important in that case, as Mr. Suleiman recalled earlier. And the court concluded its reasoning on genocidal intent by referring, and I quote, to the series of 17 factors invoked by Croatia, without having ruled out any as a matter of principle. Myanmar purports that the behavior that follows genocidal act cannot, and I quote, retrospectively shed light on the nature of the acts that preceded it. That is also wrong. Indeed, in the same case, the court underlined that state behavior, and I quote, before, during, and after the military operation in question was relevant to rule on the dolus specialis of the state. The way in which Myanmar acted after the clearance operations spectacularly highlights its genocidal intent, because the impunity that follows the exactions directly benefits those who perpetrated them. In this regard, the legal characterization of the offences being prosecuted are of no importance. It is enough to see that there were no inquiries, prosecution or sentencing commensurate to the facts under any criminal charges. What's more, if the court finds that a genocide did take place, we put it, in a distinct but complementary way, that destruction of proof and impunity amount to violations of the obligation to punish under Article 1 of the Convention. Professor Miron stated that this was circular. But there's nothing circular here, members of the court. We are simply drawing the logical legal conclusion. Indeed, proper compliance with the obligations of Article 1, that is to say, the obligation to prevent and the obligation to punish genocide, proper compliance with these obligations imply the opposite of genocidal intent. Having recalled this, I come to destruction of evidence and impunity as confirmatory indicators included for the sake of completeness of Myanmar's genocidal intent. and of members of its military benefiting from impunity. Concerning the facts connected with destruction of proof, Professor Miron said practically nothing. The court confirmed in the well-substantiated September 2025 IIMM report that you have in tab 7 of your file, the court confirmed that this was validly placed into the record as publication readily available. Myanmar chose not to say anything on the matter. Concerning the destruction of corpses via incineration or acid, Myanmar criticizes us for blindly trusting, I quote, blindly trusting an article of the Associated Press. Really, should we recall the testimony of witness NJ, whose baby was ripped from her arms, stabbed and thrown into the fire, or the testimony of witness MS, who saw large pits being dug in the sand in which corpses were thrown, covered in dry leaves, doused with a flammable liquid and burnt, which confirms the facts established by the FFM. Myanmar did not contest, and I quote, the possibility of the existence of burned bodies in mass graves. But it attempted to explain this practice via the local context, including weather conditions and alleged health concerns to avoid contaminating water sources. It referred, Professor Miron referred to the statement by witness P5513 that we have attached in tab 8 of your file. This witness tells of the existence of human remains in water basins, making the water unfit for consumption. Myanmar chooses to ignore the rest of this testimony, but claims that on that basis, incineration of the victims of its crimes is justified. It will be for the court to decide. But the truth is much simpler, and everyone understands it. Bodies buried in a mass grave could still be exhumed years later. But burnt bodies go up in smoke and are gone forever. When it comes to the burning of villages to ash and their bulldozing, Professor Miron claimed that many of the villages that appear destroyed on satellite imagery had not seen any fighting, and asked the following question. What crimes could we have been hiding or could have been hidden in locations where there is no allegation of genocidal acts? End quote. The answer is obvious. No other crime than the act of destroying these villages with no military purpose other than destroying the group. Concerning the impunity as an indicator of genocidal intent, Professor Miron hides behind, and I quote, the constitutional autonomy of states, and she believes that the Gambia, and once again I quote, is complaining about the fact that prosecution by military courts is insufficient in principle because it is not subjected to civilian control. But no, that is not what we are saying. We are saying that since the Tatmadaw is accountable only to itself, even having committed unspeakable atrocities, its impunity is immediately accessible to it without any legal obstacle or control, making genocidal intent all the more obvious. This is not a theoretical question. The fact of the matter is that no prosecution was started against the high-ranking officers who planned and ordered the 2016 and 2017 operations, nor was there any prosecution against those who obeyed, which shows how ineffective the system is, except to cover up crimes. My learned colleague also believes that we are complaining about insufficient sentencing. Now, if she is referring to the removal of some years of seniority for the purposes of calculating pensions, she is absolutely correct. That is a laughable sanction. However, if my colleague is referring to the 10-year custodial sentence for the Indian massacre, she is wrong. It is not the sentence we are criticizing, but the presidential pardon that was granted to the military personnel only 7 months into their sentence. This was a prosecution that cost Reuters journalists their freedom and only came about after Burmese military courts initially denied any incident had taken place in that location. Now, Professor Miron no doubt believed that she was defending Myanmar when she highlighted its national authorities' powers of inquiry and prosecution, and powers of discretion there. We do not deny that, to a certain extent, this power exists. However, members of the court, even assuming that there existed a degree of discretion in prosecution, the inevitable conclusion of the reasoning presented by my learned colleague is that Myanmar did indeed choose impunity. This impunity is thus part of a state policy aimed at rewarding the perpetrators for fully embracing and executing the genocidal project of the highest state authorities.
Par ailleurs,
Moreover, Mr. President, it's one thing to do nothing, but it's something entirely different to do everything to give the impression you are doing something. And that is exactly what Myanmar has done. It pretended it was investigating. For show, it set up fake inquiry board after fake inquiry board. And what did Professor Miron say? She did not challenge the facts I recounted, nor did she challenge the timeline, which we feel is particularly relevant. She brandished the Mangdor Commission and the Independent Commission of Inquiry, whose so-called investigating efforts I mentioned previously. Now, does what she says undermine the evidence of a system of impunity deliberately organized by Myanmar for the benefit of its henchmen and thus confirming genocidal intent? Absolutely not. The final conclusions of the Mangdor Commission, which my colleague refers to, speak for themselves, and they have led to no prosecution, no sanction. On the contrary, they have led to a botched investigation by the Tatmadaw, stating that the contemporaneous UN allegations were, and you'll remember that, totally wrong and untrue. My colleague also mentioned the so-called Independent Commission of Inquiry established in July 2018. As I showed during the first round, with this commission, it's really much ado about nothing. Professor Miron did not challenge the accuracy of the numbers that hasn't moved and changed over the last few years, in which I mentioned, relating to the so-called investigation and prosecutions of police officers and servicemen, a tally that I derived from the twice-yearly reports from Myanmar. Mr. President, this brings me to destruction of evidence and impunity as a violation of the obligation to punish under the Convention. I can do that briefly. First of all, this obligation is exclusively territorial as an obligation and subject to the request for extradition under Article 7, the Convention as a whole is not an instrument of interstate criminal cooperation. I note Myanmar acknowledges that the obligation to punish includes an obligation to investigate and an obligation to prosecute. Myanmar claims that the obligation to punish is an obligation of conduct, not an obligation of result. Without conceding, I will let the court decide and rule on this theoretical discussion. But I can understand that criteria must be met to trigger the obligation. But once it has been triggered, then the result is required. A result is required. In any case, you cannot seriously argue that Myanmar has made its best efforts to prosecute and punish crimes committed on its own territory by its army. So the theoretical discussion about the nature of the obligation to punish leads us nowhere, apart maybe from leading us to say that should Myanmar be found responsible for genocide, then self-evidently it is also responsible for failing to comply with the obligation to punish the masterminds and perpetrators of the genocide for any of the acts listed in Article 3. In destroying evidence of such actions, Myanmar most certainly did not show the due diligence which, according to Professor Miron, applies to this obligation to punish. Myanmar also states that the obligation to punish was not triggered because Gambia hasn't, and I quote, demonstrated that a genocide has likely been committed, as it didn't sufficiently identify the geographical location of the facts and the identity of the alleged perpetrators of the alleged genocidal act. End quote. Mr. President, members of the court, must we really respond to this? The obligation to punish is a territorial obligation, and Myanmar controls its own territory. There is no need for a third party to inform it of what has happened at home or to give it any information of what has happened. We have acts of violence known across the world, documented with extreme professionalism by UN bodies and perpetrated in Myanmar. And Myanmar would be unable to investigate and or prosecute for lack of specific identification of location of the actions or of the identity of the persons. But it is Myanmar that knows who its soldiers are. Myanmar conducted the military operation in the villages whose names it has voiced here in court. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the court, I had said in our first round of pleadings that Gambia was not requesting the court institute a presumption of bad faith on Myanmar. Having heard their arguments, the arguments of Myanmar, you probably thought I had been too generous. Rightly so. To say that the obligation to punish is not applicable to military commanders under the Convention is yet another surprising, particularly surprising legal proposition. Must I read out Article 4 of the Convention that mentions constitutionally responsible rulers and public officials? Or must I recall Article 3, which imposes a requirement to punish conspiracy and complicity in genocide, not only personal perpetration of acts listed under 2A and 2B? And what of acts listed under 2C and 2D? Can you inflict destructive conditions of life on a group and prevent births within a group without the perpetrators organizing themselves and therefore without decisions from their superiors? The authors of the Convention have obviously included within it the superiors. In fact, it feels like Myanmar is seeking to get from the court an obiter dictum clearing the head of the junta and its accomplices of any responsibility under the Convention. Mr. President, in this respect, Myanmar's defense is desperate, legally wrong, and, let me say it, disgraceful. I haven't got much time, unfortunately, to mention the obligation to enact legislation under Article 5, but can I refer you to our written submissions and to what Ms. Jones has said here in court. Professor Miron on this topic, however, claimed that Gambia is requesting the court, and I quote, to pass judgment on the conventionality of Myanmar's domestic law, which, and I'm still quoting, goes beyond the nature of your judicial function. She mentioned the constitutional autonomy of states and the legal and cultural differences between states party, end quote. By asking you to state that Myanmar did not comply with its obligations under Article 5, the Gambia in no way is denying these differences that the drafters of the convention quite clearly had in mind when they were drafting Article 5. But on this too, there is a dispute between the parties relating to the interpretation, application or fulfillment of the provision. And the court undoubtedly has the power to say that a state has failed to comply with its obligations, were that to be the case. Can I, by way of conclusion and for comprehensive presentation, mention that the destruction of evidence after the 23rd of January 2020, that is after the judgment on the order on interim measures, that Ms. Al-Amin mentioned, is clearly an internationally wrongful act, regardless of the existence of a genocide, as they go against the third provisional measure indicated by the court. According to Myanmar, our allegation rests entirely on the oral account by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. That is wrong. Wrong indeed. We have other evidence, including the September 20 report by the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, and the September 2025 IIMM report, which the respondent refuses to respond to at their own expense. Ms. Al-Amin also responded to Myanmar's denials allegedly resting on NASA satellite imagery. Can I add that these images were never submitted to the court in this approach, and that indeed Professor Miron acknowledged it. The pictures only covered Butidong Township until July 2020 and no later. Isn't that, honourable members, particularly bizarre? And I thank the court for its kind attention.
Professor Daljan, for the statement, brings this sitting to a close. The oral proceedings in the case will resume tomorrow, Tuesday, the 27th of January 2026 at 10 a.m. when the Gambia will continue its second round of oral argument. The sitting is closed.